Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, students and professors, and all the esteemed members of Rowan University academic community, I stand before you today with a profound sense of gratitude and honor as I extend my heartfelt thanks for the privilege of being invited to participate in the university's celebration of this impressive project. As already Bill has hinted on, today also is a special significant day for me as it marks the 61st birthday of Uganda, my home country. On October 9th, 1962, Uganda emerged from the shadows of colonialism, gaining independence from Britain, and this day, has been celebrated over the years. Okay, so the goal of my lecture today is to revisit the procedural curricula and other practices that occurred at Makerere between the 1950s and the early 1970s. Idi Amin came in, in 1971, and there wasn't much, other than the first 2-3 years, maybe 2 years. But after the expulsion of the Asians and the British, the whole country went in disarray, and so I can't go beyond the 1970s. So the procedure changes and practices that resulted from an ideology that was known then as Africanization is the subject of my talk. Next. So the lecture is going to be divided into 5 sections. I begin off with introductory remarks, tabling the questions that I seek to answer and my position vis-a-vis colonial policies, as well as my analytical framework and argument. In the second section, I try to give some relevant background to the development of Makerere from a technical school to a full-fledged university. In the third section, with examples, I look at Africanization, the discourse and praxis, demonstrating the extent to which they were both, anti-colonial and decolonial. In the fourth section, I revisit the student and staff struggles against cultural imperialism and racial politics in Uganda and elsewhere in Africa, and the imperialist anxieties and responses. So while the first part deals with the curricula and the administrative part, the fourth section deals with cultural imperialism at Makerere, not only at Makerere, but also in the country and in South Africa, Congo, Rhodesia, and in other places. I end with summing up conclusion. As a way of introduction, let me say that with a few notable examples, curricula and other practices at Makerere in the 1950s and early 1970s have not yet generated significant attention from anti-colonial, post-colonialist scholars. Those histories have been written, but they have not been written from the anti-colonial and decolonial perspectives. So the questions that I seek to answer, in a way, I'm limited to a few selected disciplines. In my paper, I will be limited only to a few selected disciplines, but there was anti-colonial, like work, say, for example, that was being done in the medical school, like having, like the colonialists having, say, for example, stated that, psychiatry, like Africans they don't suffer from mental illness. That mental illness was only a civilization, only civilizations that had industrialized, were the only ones that could suffer from, psychiatric, disorders. So there was work during that time in the medical school and other places, that were contesting those, colonially ingrained but wrong information about Africans. So, limited to only a few selected disciplines, I endeavor to answer the question of whether the changes in the 1950s up to the early 1970s were a conscious raising scheme of liberation that empowered individuals with critical consciousness, or were they simply critiques of the colonialists or colonial norm without turning the critical gaze inward? If the changes, approaches, and practices rejected or critiqued the epistemological frameworks of the colonizers, and in this case, the British education tradition, yet drew on the theoretical paradigmatic foundations beyond the then Uganda world, were they really anti-colonial? So like they were drawing from mostly the American, like the American model, could we say they were still, anti-colonial? I commence from a position that sees colonial policies, policies in general as representing a complex web of relations, which, like their successor, neo-colonial policies enacted by Uganda's post-colonial independence governments, were as destructive as they were generative, and tended to provoke comparable responses in an educational setting. They were, we tend to see colonialism only from the destructive point of view, but I argue that these policies were as destructive as they were generative. Next slide. So, to conceptually map the vast swath of anti-colonial and subversive intellectual efforts at Makerere through different periods, I employ cultural anthropologist's concept of refusal. This mostly, employed by Audra Simpson, who really elaborates more on this concept. To cultural anthropologists, next slide. To cultural anthropologists, this is a very bad slide, so don't read it. I'm going to talk over it. To cultural anthropologists, refusal is not only no. It is not a no. It's generative, creative. It has the potent to be generative and creative that connotes an end to something and a beginning to an end to something and a beginning to something new. Simpson, in that work, says that refusal produces or reproduces communities. It rejects hierarchical relationships to configure and create a different relationship. This understanding of refusal permits not only an alternative vision to doom, but a more optimistic future as it exemplifies both limits and possibilities. At the same time, refusal is strategic. Next one. Refusal is strategic. It is not an accidental, random act, but rather a measured, premeditated, conscious, unhurried action or step towards a particular thing, belief, or practice. While culturally, anthropologists caution us not to see refusal as simply a response to authority or a revised, modernized version of resistance. It is about recognition and about social as much as about political. In Audra Simpson's lexicon, refusal is, above all, about authorizing others. It's about not authorizing others to define or determine the conditions of engagement. So you see where I'm coming from, like looking at anti-colonial, like this concept is so useful in a way we can interrogate, colonial and colonialism in a new and more, generative way. Instead, refusal is about individuals refusing identities and restrictive structures and systems. Moreover, refusal is a gauge that indicates that a limit has been reached for things to continue in a certain way, and it is also a methodology. Thus, the concept refusal permits me not only to search for intellectual activism's productive and subversive elements at Makerere that refuse to submit to ostensibly detrimental colonial tenets, but also to map out how these subversive elements navigated between different sites of power, as well as knowledge production in terms of government, colonial government, local government, communities, activists, all social movements, and donors. Particularly the American donors, Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and Ford Foundations, to advance knowledge, curricula, and governance that spoke to the histories and lived experiences of the subjugated and marginal, and these other colonized. See, here I try to do, at least, it's purposeful, it's not accidental, premeditated, it's beyond just a no, that is Audra Richards, but it opens, the box to think about, issues in different ways. So I argue that the colonial predicament created a window. So this is my take on colonialism, both the generative and destructive. Let me say that from the creative is because it is a predicament. The predicament created a window for some pockets in the ivory tower or this development university to reimagine its role in the present and the future, positioning a complex reevaluation between theory and praxis, colonial and national interests. Far from being fully complacent with the colonial policies, progressive inquiry did not lose the spirit of anti-colonialism and non-conformity, and to a certain extent played with the politics of refusal. Key to my argument is that anti-colonial ignition often interrupted the colonial knowledge specificities, as I have said, for example, about Africans and mental health, African women's, pelvises, They are smaller than European pelvises, that African women can't give birth, therefore they have to be operated, that, and so on and so forth. We had to go through a section, but these women had been giving birth. Why are their babies dying? During the colonial period, they don't, it is all that production of that colonial knowledge about the colonized, to the extent that our wombs and pelvises are measured, and our kids, and it's the diet that they changed. They are not interrogating the knowledge that they are changing. When they change the diet, the babies become bigger, and the pelvises cannot carry, those women. They don't die because the Africans are stupid, and they don't know motherhood, or they don't understand, but they are creating new knowledge. And the anti-colonial, this anti-colonial knowledge, has to be subverted by going to finding, what are the causes beyond, what is being sold back to the mothers, in the clinics that they are setting up. Key to my argument is that this anti-colonial, that anti-colonial ignition often interrupted these knowledge specificities and uncertainties and confidences by tampering with the very process and mediums through which knowledge was produced, while suggesting alternative solutions, critiques to older normative colonial problematics. Nonetheless, it would be fallacious to argue that in the unfolding spectacle, all staff, administrators, and students reacted in the same manner. I contend that the deployment of a single story of compliance passivity through which to view Makerere masks an appreciation of the important work, however slim and naughty a few were doing. On the one hand, decolonize the institution, curricula, pedagogy, and pedagogy, as well as the production of knowledge, on the other hand, to challenge and antagonize the system at its core. The system had to be antagonized at its core. I have a quote, maybe sometime, if I have time, from Mamdani, who says, for example, Mamdani says that the education that was given this was not education, but training. It was not liberation, but enslavement. Its purpose was not to educate a person to understand the objective limits to the advancement of individual and collective welfare, but to train a person to accept and even administer the limits of an efficient, reliable, and honest way. So, yes, that could be true. But if we have only that one story, we miss out all this other stuff, like that, the antagonizing and what people are really doing with, the description of that history and leaving it there, without bringing in, the other people who were both, Ugandans and non-Ugandans in the picture, I think does a disservice. By exploring the analytical framework that formed the intellectual and pedagogical practices at Makerere in the 50s and 60s, I make a two-pronged argument. First, these changes were both critical and anti-colonial, and yet they were not. Second, that while some personnel in the colonial services positioned themselves against changes in the status quo in the hope that Makerere will facilitate prospects and space for indigenous research and researchers, both figuratively and literally, colonial education's greatest potential did lie in its ability to establish the groundwork for Makererians, educators, students, and to some extent, friends, to uncover and challenge accepted but unexamined thoughts encoded in the British tertiary education model and beyond. The British model is very important because it's Makerere and all these other universities that get, started around the same time, take on the Cambridge and Oxford model. And by the 1960s, even 1950s, we have professors who are actually professors of history, who are actually arguing, stuff that is untenable. There is no history. There is no movement in Africa. There's only, all those, if we talk about African history, we can only talk about Europeans in Africa. In a way, myopic at Cambridge and Oxford. Because for them, history could only be written from, documentary sources, archives. And, when you shake that and you bring in, oral traditions and oral sources and so on, you are revolutionizing the entire discipline on how and where and how deep that history. Historical and linguistics are now even helping us to reconstruct the histories, for example, of motherhood, of sexualities, of whatever, that go back to 800 Common Era, or even way beyond. So using words, using traditions, using oral sources, using proverbs, using whatever, this comes from Makerere. At this particular time, that makes, Oxford and Cambridge, some Oxford and Cambridge professors, look like they were from Mars. Okay, so drawing from the published and archival sources on Makerere as well as on oral history, I present a glimpse in shifts at Makerere from the 1950s to the early 1970s that could be considered as defiant and anti-colonial. Although limited in scope and data, my study seeks to outline the progress made during that time and to consider the foundational potential of challenges that remained at Makerere and with Makererians for sustained and future anti-colonial transformations of their institutions and their respective discipline. The ball starts rolling at that time. And much as we have the Idi Amin decade as a dead decade, we pick up, again, doing anti-colonial and decolonial work in the 80s, and the many departments continue. Next. Oh, yeah, that's okay. So, as a background, let me say that anti-colonial ideologies at Makerere are best comprehended against a complex background of the Uganda protectorates and later the Uganda states post-independence labor anxieties. We cannot understand the colonial policies in Uganda, and hence anti-colonial ideologies outside the colonialist anxieties over, like labor. Until the early 1920s, Uganda's colonial state was content with leaving the provision of education in the hands of missionaries and importing much of its needed clerical and other technical, as they called it, manpower from India. Amendments to this dependence was initiated by a governor, Croydon, after the First World War. Nonetheless, perceiving vocational education as a colonial government strategy to muffle students' advancement, the Young Baganda Association agitated for the secularization of education. So we see the beginnings. Thank you for giving us, missionary education, but we want secular education. We want, so we see that, the protectorate government at the same time is fearful, of indigenous Ugandans' exposure to politically objectionable radical ideas, particularly from the African Americans, which mitigated against sending the sons of the chiefs, even their most trusted chiefs abroad to study, because they would come back with radical ideas. So the very few exceptional students that were permitted to go to England were actually, they were under very close, very close surveillance. And against this background, we can deduce that the 1921 discussions leading to the establishment of a colonial-sponsored vocational training at Makerere were initiated in a politically charged and biased environment, fused with nascent, homegrown anti-colonial sentiments. As Faye Carter emphasizes, the colonial state's ultimate goal was to create an industrious but politically compliant peasantry and artisan classes. Thus, from being an altruistic venture, the objective of creating a compliant native or indigenous labor force drove the curricula of the newly founded technical school at Makerere University. We should not lose sight of this very important point, particularly the agreeable nature or the agreeable and submissive elements embedded in the concept compliance. The curricula, if it is to create a person who is compliant, a person that Mamdani talks about, that curricula needs to be, contested, or, it has created a condition by itself to be contested. Besides, the 1924 Phelps-Stokes Committee report covering East and Central Africa supported and recommended higher and specialized education for Africans akin to the education offered blacks in the United States. Carol Sickerman argues that such an education ensured white supremacy. So, it's like falling from the pan and then you fall in the fire. What is going to be done? So accordingly, courses such as law or the liberal arts that would cause Africans to question the status quo were deferred for almost a decade, only introduced at Makerere after 1949. It is important also to emphasize that the Makerere College Ordinance of 1930 squarely secured the college to the colonial office and colonial government. Notwithstanding, in response to the growing request for higher education in British colonies, in 1933, the Colonial Office endorsed a proposal to advance a few institutions in close relation with London University to a higher level. This is good because it is not Oxford, it is not Cambridge. At London University, we have more progressive minds, but at the same time, it is within a colonial context. So in 1935, however, and in opposition to what the colonial East African Director of Education saw as unwise implementation and acceleration of African demand for full-fledged university, he advocated for measured pace. A measured pace. Don't go far. Don't go fast. Fast. So the disinclination was overridden by the decision of the Commission of Higher Education set up by the colonial government in 1936, which visited Uganda in 1937. In line with the colonial labor policy, the commission, led by the Parliamentary Secretary for Colonies, was essentially concerned with training the cadre of natives usable within the colonial establishment. The colonial establishment was hierarchical. We didn't have the same, policy on paper apartheid, but it was hierarchical, where we have the Europeans, the Asians, and the Africans. We didn't have the coloreds. So they were called Indians. It didn't matter whether they were from Pakistan or whether they were from Sri Lanka, or they were just called Indians, blanket. This is a hierarchical, education system, which again, the anti-colonial, the anti-colonial ideologies at Makerere are going to refuse. If you are to start up, a University of East Africa, if you are not going to bring your British, students to study, the Indians have to be part of this. They have to go to be part of this, population. In a way, Africans and Indians to study together. So those were some of the demands. Okay, so this university will serve Kenya, Tanzania, Zanzibar. By that time, it was Tanganyika, Zanzibar, and Uganda. And despite what Margaret McPherson identified as a glorious achievement of this phase, Nazel Motani argues that the African potential was severely stifled by the ill-advised and myopic education offered at Makerere College between 1922 and 1940. Another committee, which created what came to be known as Asquith universities, was established in 1944 with the task of appraising the development of higher education in the event that Britain relinquished its colonies following the Second World War. Both the model and the rhetoric championed by this commission prudently concealed Britain's commitment to maintaining the already entrenched colonial ties. Frederick Cooper contends that in the years leading to the end of the World War II, colonial authorities came to envision a world that they no longer ruled, but that world that they thought could function along principles they understood. So the education system, much as they are no longer there, but let it be under principles that they understand. Thus, it could be argued that because of its overt and covert aims, the Commission recommended the elevation of Makerere and other similar colonial colleges to university status in an affiliated and special relationship to the University of London. Remington, among others, has argued that one aim of the special relationship with the London School was to ensure the provision and maintenance of academic standards with respect to curriculum. Okay, 10 minutes? Okay. Teaching, administration, such a relationship in addition will facilitate, the graduates to enroll, in a way. So, but again, Sickerman argues that the Asquith colleges, as they became known, became the prime avenue of preserving this post-colonial influence. Let me go quickly and say maybe move quickly to in short, let me summarize all of that and say, in short, founded and funded as a colonial project in 1922 at independence in 1962. And thereafter, Makerere became a national project bearing a colonial heritage that until the late 1960s remained largely unperturbed. Albeit from 1950s onwards, the institution became entangled in a discourse and practices that came to be known as Africanization. But what was Africanization? And so many different definitions. But I argue that the term is best comprehended in relationship to the varied and often contested meanings and interpretations of the idiom decolonization. We cannot understand anti-colonial until we understand decolonization and the other attendant issues. Okay, so, Fanon, Sayid, Baba, Chakrabarti, Ndolevu, all of them have contributed positively to the discussion about, decolonization. Foucault, on the other hand, argues that as soon as people begin to have trouble thinking in the way they have been thought, you are black. Since I start, having trouble when someone thinks about me as black, Foucault says that then transformation becomes at the same time very urgent. That person is likely to act very unremitting, and it becomes entirely possible. I have so many examples, I have so many examples of, curricula, of, the demands in religious studies, demands in history, demands in singing, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, get another one, the drivers of this. Some of the anti-colonial idol, drivers, we have, can someone tell me who the top one is? Ali Mazrui. Hey, Ali Mazrui. We have, Who is this one in the middle? Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Who is this one? Okot Bitek. Who is this one? And who are these? You know, like, so we have Semakula Chiwanuka. We have, you know, like, they translated and played, you know, like Shakespeare, you know, using African characters, you know, like, and so on. So really transforming. And these books that you see are really, you know, like, in a way, wakening up, doing so many things. Literature, you know, like, say, for example, they pushed back against colonialism by engaging in visual and performing arts and creative literary modes in the form of fiction and poems, using the tools of their colonizers for three purposes. First, to introduce African audiences to some things they did not know about colonialism. Second, to challenge some of the things their audiences thought they knew or simply overlooked. They simply overlooked. And third, to engage or persuade their audiences to think beyond the current situations. These books are full of, you know, really anti-colonial rhetoric. You know, like, these are poems, you know, like, so we have Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Hermit, you know, like, it's about alienation. It's about, but they are characters, and they are talking and they are writing, but they are really doing anti-colonial, very anti-colonial, and the colonialists are not understanding that actually, you know, like, this is really a real weapon. Okay, so like the historians are writing from colonialism to independence, and Ali Mazrui is saying, you know, like, is also doing his political work in different ways. Okay, so the rhetoric is through in conferences, in newspapers, in, you know, like, books. They start magazines like Pinpoint, Makerere, Transition, and all of those that are really aimed at what, you know, like, Ngugi wa Thiong'o later on writes as decolonizing the African mind. You know, like, but, you know, like, the way, you know, like, those vibes are already there before even he writes this book in the 80s. Joseph Okello, for example, wrote that unless new African staff were mentally decolonized, the mere seabirth of Africanization would not satisfy students in a revolutionary, you know, like, mood. You know, like, all of this is in their, you know, like, magazines, newspapers, and so on. The curriculums, they get changed, and there's also, you know, like, a protest against cultural imperialism and racial politics. Like, for example, here in North America, you have the Halloween. The British also had their own form of Halloween, but it was a must in Uganda, and we had to do, you know, like, bonfires and so on. Semakula Chiwanuka, you know, like, contests, and, you know, like, and say, you know, like, why should we be, you know, like, bound to spirits that are not ours, you know, like, and in the years, you know, like let them, you know, like, they have refused us to worship our own spirits, and they are telling us to honor their, you know, like, they are dead, and we are not part and parcel of. So cultural imperialism. You know, like, the work against, you know, like, South Africa, you know, like, the embargo, you know, like, the Zimbabwe, you know, like, the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the demonstrations in Kampala, and so on and so forth. So there are anxieties. You know, like, the colonialists definitely get, because they are getting what they didn't expect. You know, like, and when they are getting what they didn't expect, the anxieties come, they flare up, and they start even censoring their own, you know, like British, you know, like personnel that they thought harbored, you know, like socialist or Marxist, you know, like tendencies. To be a good citizen, let me conclude. Otherwise, I'll never be invited. You know, like, okay. So, in conclusion, let me say that I can elaborate in the question time or over dinner. You know, like I have jumped a lot in terms of the paper. But in conclusion, let me say that the work of decolonizing colonial institutions, such as universities, is not easy. There is a saying that moving a university is like moving a cathedral. Hard stuff. Part of the challenge lies in the absence of one ready-made model to emulate. In addition to de-entrenching these institutions' foundational dreams and fantasies, including myths. The cases I have presented in this paper provide a glimpse of what was possible, or what the possible building blocks that model could be. How do you work with donors? Rockefeller came back in the 80s and 90s. You know, like, so the building models are entrenched in there. All in all, the emerging political consciousness among the professors and others, lecturers, fellows, tutors, deans, students, and friends in the Makerere community provided the impetus for questioning Eurocentric normative knowledge production and later the logic of colonial higher education, whether at Makerere or elsewhere. This consciousness generated critical changes in the curriculum at Makerere that underpinned both the success and the emancipatory potential of these initiatives. Thus, empowered students and staff wrote cultural histories and created literature of and for their societies based on research focusing on local and regional cultures and area-specific political or social events and ideas, work which was now seen as creating valuable and acceptable intellectual and scholastic knowledge. In the sense that these initiatives asserted African cultural beliefs, practices, and ways of knowing, they can be viewed as anti-colonial. Yet, across the institution, the new curriculum did not outrightly reject Eurocentric cultural knowledge and pedagogical methods. You still stand up and teach, regurgitate, you know, like let your students regurgitate, do Cambridge, you know, like Oxford, you know, like national exams, get the Cambridge certificate. Think you are very learned if, you know, like you go to Oxford and Cambridge, rather than Royal University. So the Eurocentric cultural knowledge and pedagogical methods, some of them are not shaken to the core. Rather, anti-colonial liberals were advocates of excellence within European and African knowledge systems. It was not an either or. Okay, so, and that's despite the efforts of scholars such as Webster, who was, you know, like Canadian, Welborn, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Semakula Chiwanuka, Jinjera Pinchwa, like Zirimu, Rubadiri, and others who advocated for Makererians' access to both indigenous and colonial intellectual frameworks and knowledge systems, the institution remains sadly undecolonized. Nonetheless, commonly accepted Eurocentric forms of research approach, as well as claims to universal truth and the superiority of Western paradigms over local Ugandan paradigms were confronted and to a certain extent disrupted to accommodate local approaches and perspectives about ways of knowing and being. All these initiatives to Africanize challenge legitimate or certified knowledge claims and questions the very processes by which such knowledge was produced. Moreover, reappropriated and re-revolutionized these initiatives provided an alternative platform to Eurocentric approaches to Makererians, especially in such departments as history, political science, religious studies, to strive to rewrite Uganda's past and present. As I end my talk, allow me to wish Rowan University a joyful centenary celebration and extend my warmest wishes to Uganda as it continues its journey of progress and development. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I look forward to engaging in insightful discussion with all of you at dinner or, like in the question time.